Chapter 16, Part 1 of Mounted Police Life in Canada. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mounted Police Life in Canada by Captain Burton, Deane. Chapter 16, Louis Riel, executed for treason. I have often wondered whether, if there had been no rebellion in 1885, real estate in the business centre of Calgary would have been selling for $4,000 per foot frontage in the year 1912. I trow not. The subject matter of my sketch, prior to July 1884, had been living in the United States, where he had become naturalised, and where he was earning a living as a school teacher. He was induced to return to Canada by a deputation of prominent men among the French half-breeds of the North Country, with a view to assisting them in obtaining sundry rights from the Dominion Government, and the redress of certain grievances which they had or claimed to have. At that time the country had rather fallen short of the expectations which had been raised about it, and settlers generally were far from being in a prosperous condition. The winter of 1882 had been a very hard one, witness the loss of some 8,000 or 9,000 head of Senator Cochrane's ranch cattle. This was due in part to bad management, it is true, but the historical fact is indisputable. Newcomers felt that the conditions of life in the country were cruel. The winter of 1883 was also hard, and a good many people in the western country began to regret having come. Money was scarce, and, to use a popular expression, the bottom was falling out of the whole thing. I knew a man who had a place about 8 miles out of Regina, who used to make periodical trips to the Pile of Bones Creek with 3 barrels in a wagon to take home water for domestic and stock purposes. With the outbreak of the rebellion in 1885, every farmer who owned or could provide himself with a team of horses and a wagon could hire himself out to the Government at $10 per day. Money poured into the country to feed and supply the troops and police. Militia officers and men visited the country on service when otherwise they would never have thought of coming so far west, and the North West Territories and their possibilities thus became widely known. In short, the rebellion saved the country which, as an Eastern correspondent wrote to me in 1884, was not what it had been cracked up to be. The climate alone was a factor that compelled very serious consideration. On New Year's Eve 1884 the thermometer registered 58 degrees below zero. On the following day it stood at 48 degrees below zero, with a wind blowing at the rate of 55 miles an hour. We had a set of instruments at Regina and used to keep records for the meteorological department. It was the custom on New Year's Day for the gentlemen to call upon the ladies, who remained at home on purpose to receive them, and offered to their visitors whatever refreshment they happened to have in the house, from tea to liqueurs. In this way one had to drink warily, because one was bound to take something in every house one entered, and it sometimes became a problem how to regulate oneself without doing violence to one's own feelings or of offending the susceptibilities of the hostesses, whose hospitality was always profuse. On this occasion, however, my visits were very short. I could not keep my horses standing in the bitter wind, and a handshake with a Happy New Year wish was as much as could be compressed into each ceremonial. Nor was the weather inclement only in the winter. I find from my diary that on the night of June 20th, 1885, a hard frost cut off potatoes and tomatoes, so that the climate was as uncertain as it was unsparing. All this helped to make the ordinary settler view the half-breed agitation with indifference. He had so many troubles of his own that he did not care whether the half-breeds were given scrip or not. In the north, at Prince Albert, Carleton and Battleford, it was different. The public there viewed with growing apprehension the agitation of the half-breed element, which largely predominated in the population. The prelates and priesthood of the Roman Catholic Church sent warning after warning to the members of the Dominion Cabinet, and the Mounted Police reports which passed through my hands sounded an ever increasing note of alarm as the later months of 1884 and the early months of 1885 rolled on. In the autumn of 1884 Mr. Fred White, Comptroller of the Mounted Police and Sir John Macdonald's chief political agent, came westward and travelled through the Battleford Prince Albert country in company with the Premier's son, Hugh John Macdonald. When he returned from that trip to Regina, he handed me a long telegraphic dispatch to be converted into cipher and sent to the Minister, Sir David Macpherson, who was then taking Sir John Macdonald's part of the administration, the latter having gone to England. As Mr. White was a special emissary, one would have supposed that his communication would have received some attention, but nothing was done. No steps were taken to check the conflagration which was evidently brewing, and on March 26, 1885, the first shot was fired at Duck Lake. Riel was brought to Regina by train and handed over to me on May 23 by Captain George Young of the Winnipeg Field Batteries. In reporting his arrival to the Police Department at Ottawa, I said I intended to allow no visitor to have speech of the prisoner without a permit from the Prime Minister. I religiously held to this regulation of my own making, and it saved me a great deal of trouble. There was a stock answer ready for everyone who applied at the guard room, and all applicants were informed that they might take it as a final reply without pestering me to death. Riel had quite a number of sympathisers in Quebec, and from that province came the funds which provided him with legal assistance at his subsequent trial. Not long after his arrival at the guard room, I was accosted one day in town by a gentleman who said he was the editor of a Quebec newspaper and had come to Regina on purpose to see the prisoner. I replied that if he had taken the precaution of providing himself with Sir John Macdonald's permit, there would be no difficulty in arranging an interview with Riel, and I asked if he had made any arrangements to that end at the Police Department in Ottawa. He said he had not done so. He had not supposed any such course to be necessary. I had to regret then that I was not at liberty to allow him to see Riel. He looked at me with a sort of pitying smile and said, "My dear sir, I think you hardly realise that I have come all this way from Quebec on purpose to see this man." I assured him that I fully appreciated the lengths of the journey which he had taken, but Louis Riel, who had led 2 rebellions in Western Canada, was a very important prisoner who would unquestionably be tried for his life, and that, until the policy of the Government was made known with regard to allowing him to receive visitors, I was not at liberty to relax the rule which existed. There was nothing more to be said or done, and the unfortunate editor returned to Quebec. It was not until June 21 that the Lieutenant Governor showed me a telegram from Ottawa to the effect that Government do not wish prisoners to be interviewed before arrival of Crown Counsel at Regina. The matter was placed in the discretion of Mr. Christopher Robinson, Q.C., the senior counsel for the Crown, and his were the only permits that I recognised. Riel himself was given to understand from the first that visitors would have no access to him. He then wanted to be given newspapers, but these too were denied to him. He was told that he might have books or magazines or literature of that nature, but nothing respecting the topics of the day. He, of course, wanted to have a spectacular trial, preferably in the East, before the eyes of the whole world, and little dreamt that his case would be disposed of by a stipendiary magistrate, a justice of the peace, and 6 jurors in a little embryo town like Regina. A letter which he addressed to the Premier summed up his views in its opening sentence. When he had any particular clerical work that he wanted to do, I used to let him use the Commissioner's office. This was a small office opening off mine, which was not otherwise used, as the Commissioner was in the north, and Riel and his escort could sit there without inconveniencing anyone. The following is a copy of a letter he wrote. He made 3 copies of it, one for the Premier, one for the Lieutenant Governor, and one for me.
Jésus, Marie, Joseph, sauvez-nous, intercédez pour nous, priez pour nous. Prison de Regina, 16 juillet 1885. Confidentiel. Au très honorable Sir John A. Macdonald, Premier ministre de la puissance du Canada. Monsieur le Premier ministre, j'implore un procès complet et à la Cour suprême. Je désire me disculper depuis 15 ans. Si vous cédez à mes instances, si vous m'accordez toute la latitude dont j'ai besoin pour me défendre, Dieu me secourant, non seulement je me clairerai, mais la grande responsabilité des troubles du Nord-Ouest en 69-70 et en 85 tombera lourdement sur les honorables messieurs Blake et Mackenzie et sur les journaux leurs principaux organes. Votre politique au sujet du Nord-Ouest se trouvera comme débarrassée des obstacles que ces deux hommes puissants se sont efforcés de vous susciter depuis 69. Mon intérêt n'est pas seulement de me disculper. Je désire me réhabiliter. Si par le soutien de Dieu et la faveur des bonnes gens, il m'est permis de viser aux avantages d'une vraie réhabilitation et d'une indemnité équitable, ce serait pour rentrer dans la politique manitobaine. Je m'en coûte d'abandonner ma patrie, ma mère, mes frères, mes sœurs, mes parents, mes amis. De plus, j'ai à cœur de continuer mon œuvre. J'apprécie le grand talent des hommes qui ont gouverné et qui gouvernent, encore à l'heure qu'il est, Manitoba. Mais il me semble qu'ils ne comprennent pas sa fondation. C'est pour cela que cette province n'est pas à l'aise et que la Confédération s'en sent. La Manitoba profite, mais il me fait penser à ces personnes qui engraissent sans avoir de santé. Il ne lui serait peut-être pas inutile que j'arrivasse un jour à son ministre. Et il me serait particulièrement avantageux à moi d'y arriver pour continuer avec votre gouvernement ce qui a été commencé il y a 15 ans par l'acte de Manitoba. J'avais l'honneur de vous dire dans ma communication du 6 courant que l'Irlande, c'est que je pense, pouvait devenir heureuse et en même temps les seigneurs anglais continuer à avoir leurs revenus comme l'ordinaire. Le principe que j'aurais à proposer pour arriver à ce résultat me paraît clair et simple. Si mon pays natal m'honorait un jour au point de me faire asservir au premier siège de son ministre, je vous soumettrai mes vues. Dans le cas où il vous serait possible de les approuver, je vous les présenterai pour mettre fin aux better terms qui fatiguent la Confédération sans apporter d'amélioration définitive au Manitoba. Vous me procuriez sans doute l'avantage de modifier en mieux ce que je n'aurais pas encore assez mûr dans mes manières de voir. Après les avoir inaugurées dans la jeune province, vous seriez à même d'examiner comment mes idées fonctionneraient. Si elles réussissaient, vous pourriez les généraliser à toute la puissance. De là, Mère Patrie en jugerait elle-même. Et avant trop longtemps peut-être, auriez-vous, vous, la gloire, et moi, le plaisir de les voir appliquées à la situation de l'Irlande par la haute autorité de parlement anglais même. Le principe et les vues dont j'ai l'honneur de vous dire un mot sont en germe dans la Constitution, l'acte du Manitoba. Monsieur le Premier ministre, les meilleures idées ont besoin d'être comprises pour être mises en vogue. Et lors même, la main de Dieu et celle de mes amis me feraient sortir de ma prison pour me porter à la tête du ministère provincial du Manitoba, il me serait encore bien difficile de faire mon chemin s'il n'y avait pas là un gouverneur qui me comprît. Depuis que je suis à Regina, tous mes écrits ont passé par les mains de monsieur le capitaine Deane. Ce noble officier connaît mes façons de penser. Et pour ne pas le gêner, en lui faisant auprès de vous des louanges qui ont passé par son office, je vous disais tout court que ce serait, à mon avis, un honneur pour le Manitoba d'avoir un lieutenant-gouverneur tel que lui, pour l'honorable monsieur Aikens, un successeur d'aussi grand mérite, et pour moi, un guide dont les conseils me seraient si utiles. Mes bienveillants avocats sont arrivés d'avant-hier. J'ai eu la joie d'une entrevue avec eux. Ils vont insister pour que mon procès ait lieu en Bas-Canada et par devant la Cour suprême. Veuillez m'accorder cela à moi. Veuillez céder aux bonnes représentations de mes savants avocats. Lorsqu'on me conduira dans l'Est, si vous consentez bien que j'y sois conduit, arrangement pourrait être pris pour qu'à mon arrivée, 3 avocats conservateurs, un Canadien français, un Irlandais et un Anglais protestant m'offrent leur bon service. Grande serait ma reconnaissance pour un tel honneur. Ma cause serait plaidée au point de vue des intérêts du parti opposé. Monsieur le capitaine pourrait me conduire. Il suivrait tout le procès. Il vous verrait souvent. Ce serait comme naturellement que vous pourriez le nommer lieutenant-gouverneur du Manitoba. Moi, j'aurais le bonheur de m'en retourner à Saint-Vital, goûter la paix qui m'y attend depuis 15 ans. Et vous, que mes vœux ne vous soient pas suspects, vous aurez augmenté de beaucoup le thème de vos récompenses. Si mes bons souhaits peuvent sortir au travers des barreaux de ma petite et sombre cellule, si ma stricte captivité n'empêche pas ma voix de se faire entendre, puissiez-vous un jour occuper le trône vice-royal de la puissance pour le plus grand bien de cette confédération canadienne dont vous êtes l'un des glorieux fondateurs. J'ai l'honneur d'être, avec beaucoup de respect, votre très humble serviteur. S.D. Louis Riel.
A perusal of this letter must, to my mind, irresistibly convey the idea that the writer was cracked. I do not know of any word in the English language which so aptly fits the occasion. Here was a man on the point of being tried for his life, for crimes committed in the Northwest Territories in the year of grace 1885, blandly making suggestions as to the government of Manitoba and of Ireland, of all places. It has been said that Riel's grandfather was of Irish descent, and that his name was Riley, but I have heard the statement contradicted just as positively as it was made. Be that as it may, it can excite no wonder that Louis Riel was a heavy burden for his legal advisers to carry. These gentlemen had been retained by Riel's sympathisers in the province of Quebec, and sent westward to give the unhappy man as good a run for his life as possible. Appeals had been made on behalf of the French-Canadian race in the province of Quebec, and this dispatch of counsel to defend Riel was one of the results. The names of the gentlemen in question were Mr. Charles Fitzpatrick, now Sir Charles, Chief Justice of Canada, Mr. F. X. Lemieux, and Mr. I. N. Greenshields, all of Quebec Province. With them was associated Mr. (now Honourable Mr. Justice) T. C. Johnstone of the Northwest Territorial Bar. The Quebec gentlemen arrived at Regina on July 15th, and Riel was arraigned on the 20th. There and then began the most momentous trial that had ever taken place in Western Canada. Mr. Osler, in his opening address to the jury, called it "the most serious trial that has ever probably taken place in Canada." At the opening of the court, Mr. Justice Richardson announced that Mr. Henry Lejeune would be the Associate Justice of the Peace. The clerk opened the court, and the prisoner was placed in the dock. In reply to a question by the presiding magistrate, Riel admitted that he had been furnished with a copy of the charge, of the panel of the jurors, and of the list of the witnesses for the prosecution. He was then arraigned. There were, based upon an old statute of Edward III, 6 charges almost identical, and the wording of them was so quaint that it is perhaps permissible to quote the first charge at length, and to point out wherein the other 5 differed from it. The first charge read: that Louis Riel, being subject of Our Lady the Queen, not regarding the duty of his allegiance, nor having the fear of God in his heart, but being moved and seduced by the instigation of the devil as a false traitor against our said Lady the Queen, and wholly withdrawing the allegiance, fidelity, and obedience which every true and faithful subject of our said Lady the Queen should and by right ought to bear towards our said Lady the Queen, in the year aforesaid, together with, on the 26th day of March, divers other traitors to the said Alexander David Stewart unknown, armed and arrayed in a warlike manner, that is to say, with guns, rifles, pistols, bayonets, and other weapons, being then unlawfully, maliciously, and traitorously assembled and gathered together against our said Lady the Queen at the locality known as Duck Lake, in the said Northwest Territories of Canada, and within this realm, and did then maliciously and traitorously attempt and endeavour by force and arms to subvert and destroy the constitution and government of this realm as by law established, and deprive and depose our said Lady the Queen of and from the style, honour, and kingly name of the imperial crown of this realm, in contempt of our said Lady the Queen and her laws, to the evil example of all others in the like case offending, contrary to the duty of the allegiance of him the said Louis Riel, against the form of the statute in such case made and provided, and against the peace of our said Lady the Queen, her crown and dignity. Charge number 2 read exactly like number 1, except that it charged the offence to have been committed at the locality known as Fish Creek, and the third charge quoted the locality known as Batouche. The first 3 charges averred that Louis Riel was a subject of Our Lady the Queen. Charges 4, 5, and 6 were exact reproductions of 1, 2, and 3, except that they averred that Louis Riel was then living in the Dominion of Canada and under the protection of our Sovereign Lady the Queen. The alternative charges were necessitated by the fact that Louis Riel had, between 1870 and 1885, become a naturalised citizen of the United States. Mr. Fitzpatrick then submitted a plea to the jurisdiction of the court, which, briefly, set forth that the said Hugh Richardson in open court, with a justice of the peace and a jury of 6, has no jurisdiction to try the offences charged in the information. Counsel for the Crown entered a demurrer against the plea, and the prisoner's counsel joined issue upon the demurrer. It was a very pretty quarrel as it stood, but Providence was on the side of the big battalions. The Government had provided some legal giants to uphold their end of the stick, to wit, Mr. Christopher Robinson, Q.C., and Mr. B.B. Osler, Q.C., of the Ontario Bar, the then Deputy Minister of Justice, Mr. Burbage, together with a French advocate from Quebec named Mr. T.C. Cassegrain. With these gentlemen was associated a member of the local bar, Mr. D.L., now Honourable Mr. Justice, Scott. I should perhaps note here that Mr. B.B. Osler was a Liberal in politics, and Mr. Robinson a Conservative. The 2 main questions before the court at this stage were these: 1. Had the court, constituted as it then was, authority under the statute of 1880 to try the case? 2. Did not that statute interfere with and entirely override the provisions of Magna Carta? Mr. Fitzpatrick opened the ball. He dived manfully into the recesses of the Magna Carta and stirred up the dry bones of King John's unruly barons to show that the statute of 1880 passed by the Dominion under which Louis Riel's court was constituted was repugnant to the provisions of the Great Charter, which provided that no man shall be arrested, nor imprisoned, nor banished, nor deprived of life, etc., but by the judgment of his peers and the laws of the land. He quoted authorities to show that a trial by jury is understood to mean ex vi termini, a trial by jury of 12 men, impartially selected, who must unanimously concur in the guilt of the accused before a legal conviction can be had. He spoke very ably and at great length, and was followed by Mr. Greenshields, who, in another speech of considerable length, contended that the statute of 1880 was entirely ultra vires of the Dominion Parliament. It was a great treat to hear Mr. Christopher Robinson's reply. He spoke easily and unaffectedly, with an absence of effort that to me was quite remarkable, and in a quiet conversational tone. He took an interest in all the odd little incidents that occurred in court. If there was a window to be opened or shut, he followed with his eyes the entire operation. A man on the opposite side of the table was sketching a head on his blotter, and Mr. Robinson seemed to take the greatest interest in this head, which promised at first to be that of a girl, but afterwards developed some hair on the face, and was possibly intended for a sketch of the prisoner. Be that as it may, Mr. Robinson watched the progress of the drawing, and any other little incident that attracted his attention, all the while dropping some such commonplace platitudes as these: "As regards the larger portion of my learned friend's arguments, which was addressed to the reasonableness or unreasonableness of those different enactments, we decline to follow them into that argument at all. Those laws are Acts of Parliament, passed by British subjects for British subjects. They have existed for years, and until the past few months their validity has never been questioned. As regards their reasonableness or unreasonableness, I would say this also, that we must have regard always to the circumstances and conditions of the country for which the laws are enacted, and it is impossible that everything which my learned friend calls the fundamental principle of the British Constitution can be extended to all parts of the Empire. But if they rely upon that argument, it is a further answer to say that there is no greater fundamental principle of the British Constitution than the supremacy of Parliament. Neither the right of grand jury, nor the petit jury, nor the right of a jury of any kind, is so much a fundamental principle of the British Constitution as the supremacy of Parliament. So that we have this course of legislation. First, we have the Imperial Legislature saying to the Parliament of the Dominion, 'You can make such laws as you think proper for the government of Rupert's Land.' Next, we have the Parliament of the Dominion under that power making laws, and then we have the Imperial Parliament again, in view of the enactment which they have passed, making this enactment valid. For these reasons, it has been thought on the part of the Crown that nothing could be plainer than the course of legislation under which this court is constituted, and from which it derives its jurisdiction." After all the arguments were concluded, Mr. Justice Richardson delivered himself as follows: "Now, if I understand the contention of Mr. Fitzpatrick, it is that this Act of 1880, so far as it relates to the trial of criminal offences such as this, is ultra vires." Mr. Fitzpatrick: "My contention is that the Act of 1880, in so far as it relates to the trial of capital cases, is ultra vires." Mr. Justice Richardson: "Well, as I cannot hold that, I must sustain the demurrer." The discomfited counsel's face was a study. It was certainly the face of the most disgusted man in British North America at that time. It looked around the court room with an expression of wonderment, which seemed to ask, "Is this all the expression of opinion that is due to me? After all my research, after all my eloquence, are my arguments to be turned down by a ruling of less than a dozen words?" I followed his gaze around the courtroom and failed to see any expression of sympathy on any face there. The prevalent feeling in the North West Territories was this: we have taken our lives in our hands to open up a new country, and in working out our own salvation we do not want to be let and hindered by old-time provincial prejudices. To such an extent did this sentiment prevail that the North West Council, which was then partly appointed and partly elective, had passed an ordinance practically prohibiting the collection from a North West settler of a debt incurred by him in the older provinces. This was, of course, disallowed by the Government in Council, but the feeling was very much alive all the same. The plea to the jurisdiction of the court having been disposed of, Mr. Johnstone was put up to demur to the information on the ground that the first three charges were laid against the prisoner as a British subject, and that the other three were silent as to his nationality. That is to say, that charges 4, 5 and 6 did not allege that the prisoner was the subject of a foreign state at peace with Her Majesty. Mr. Burbage replied: "In 3 counts we have charged him as a British subject, and with having violated his natural allegiance, and in 3 counts we have charged him with having acted contrary to his local allegiance. It is quite sufficient that a man may live in a country to be guilty of treason." The magistrate overruled this demurrer, and the prisoner was called upon to plead, which he did. "I am not guilty." One whole day had been taken up, and the end was not yet so far as preliminaries were concerned. At the opening of the court on the following morning, the prisoner's counsel applied for an adjournment of the trial. They said that 3 witnesses, named Dumont, Dumas, and Nault, who were in Montana, were material to the defence. Mr. Greenshields represented that they would come to court to give evidence on the assurance of counsel that they would be protected. He also said, "It is an undoubted fact, competent of proof, that the accused was confined in the Beaufort Asylum for a period of 3 years, from 1872 to 1875. The defence required certain medical witnesses from Quebec and Toronto to testify to the condition of the prisoner's mind at that time." Mr. Greenshields said, "The court can see the necessity in a trial of this kind, where life is involved, that we should be given the fullest opportunity to make a proper defence. What we want is a fair trial. That is what we are here for, and we should obtain the fullest and fairest trial. And if after a full and fair trial the court and jury find that the prisoner is guilty of the offence charged, we will have done our duty before the court and the people. The people of this country will be satisfied that no injustice has been done. If, after the production of such affidavits as these, the prisoner is forced on to trial on the charge of high treason, public feeling will not be satisfied. A trial of this kind, in which the public are all interested, must be a fair and impartial trial." This was simply playing to the gallery of the Quebec party, which was "agin the Government," and Mr. Robinson, when his time came to reply, metaphorically boxed Mr. Greenshields' ears for his insinuations. He said, "I regret extremely that my learned friend Mr. Greenshields should have departed so far from what I regard as professional courtesy and professional etiquette as to make the remarks which he thought it right to make in the discharge of his duty. As to part of his remarks, I understood, and I think everyone else must have understood, that if they meant anything, they certainly meant to imply a threat against those acting for the Crown. That if they declined to accede to the contention, public opinion would be brought to bear upon them, and public opinion would not support them. We are answerable to public opinion, but we are perfectly content to be answerable to public opinion. But I repeat again my surprise that that tone of spirit and sort of address should have been thought necessary in a case of this description." The defence at this time were asking for an adjournment of about a month to enable them to produce necessary witnesses, and had represented that the prisoner was a man of little or no means, and that the necessary witnesses could not be produced without the assistance of the Crown. End of chapter 16, part 1. Part 2 of Mounted Police Life in Canada. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mounted Police Life in Canada by Captain Burton, Deane. Chapter 16, Part 1. Louis Riel, executed for treason. Mr. Osler outlined to the jury the story which he proposed to prove by the evidence, and I need do no more than record his closing remarks. "I believe the facts as I have opened them to you will be fully and thoroughly sustained by the evidence, and there will be this further matter appear in evidence, that the prisoner was not there for the purpose so much of aiding the half-breeds as he was there for the purpose of utilising the half-breeds for his own selfish ends. You will find throughout the evidence in this case that it was not so much the rights of the half-breeds he was making, as the power and benefit of Louis Riel, and money that Louis Riel wanted to extort from the Government. It will appear that this so-called patriot, leader of an oppressed people, was willing to leave the country and go wherever the Government wanted him, if he got a sum of money from the Government. Gentlemen, when he found that the church to which he belonged, to which his principal supporters belonged, was against him in the movement, he had more ground to play upon his material, and, to feed his own vanity and ambition, He had himself named as the leader and prophet of his new religion. The prophet of the Saskatchewan was the cry under which his poor dupes, and many of them should have known better, were supposed to rally, intending by combining religious power to follow on the North Saskatchewan the methods of Eastern leaders. I think you will find the evidence shows that he was utterly careless of his methods, and had but one object, his own power or money, and he did not care whose lives he sacrificed. These statements were, in every instance, fully justified by the evidence which followed. It was shown beyond doubt that Riel himself was the head and shoulders of the whole movement. In the camp of Poundmaker, an Indian chief, was found a letter in Riel's writing, signed by himself, dispatched after the Duck Lake skirmish, wherein 9 men were killed, in which he said, "Praise God for the success He has given us. Capture all the police you possibly can, preserve their arms, take Fort Battle, but save the provisions, munitions and arms. Send a detachment to us of at least 100 men." In another letter, proved at the trial to be in his handwriting, addressed to the French and English Métis (mixed breeds) from Battle River to Fort Pitt, he said, "We will help you to take Fort Battle and Fort Pitt. Try and have the news which we send to you conveyed as soon as possible to the Métis and Indians of Fort Pitt. Tell them to be on their guard, to prepare themselves for anything. Take with you the Indians, gather them together everywhere. Take all the ammunition you can, in whatever stores they may be. Murmur, growl, and threaten. Rouse up the Indians." A good many of the Indians whom he talked so lightly of rousing were refugee Sioux who had come into Canada after the Custer massacre, and had not gone back with Sitting Bull when he returned to the United States. Very undesirable persons to rouse up. Dr. John H. Willoughby deposed that he went from Saskatoon, where he was practising medicine, to Batouche, a distance of about 50 miles, on March 16, and there saw Riel with about 60 or 70 armed half breeds. Riel told him that his plans were now mature, and that, as soon as he struck the first blow, he would be joined by half breeds and Indians, and that the United States were at his back. He intended to divide the country into 7 portions, and they were to be given to the Bavarians, Poles, Italians, German and Irish. There was to be a new Ireland in the North West, and the Irish of the United States were to be given a chance, as well as the inhabitants of the distressful country. He pointed to his men, and said to Dr. Willoughby, "You see now I have my police. In 1 week that little government police will be wiped out of existence." He added that the rebellion of 15 years ago would not be a patch upon this one. Mr. Charles Nolan had the time of his life. He was a very prominent half breed who had strongly sympathised with Riel and his aspirations, so long as he kept them within bounds. When Riel told him that he had decided to induce the people to take up arms, Nolan decided that it was time to drop the connection. He did so, and gave evidence to the Crown. He said in part, "In the beginning of December 1884, he, Riel, began to show a desire to have money. He spoke to me about it first, I think. He said he wanted $10,000 or $15,000. Q. From whom would he get the money? He said that the Canadian Government owed him about $100,000, and then the question arose who the persons were whom he would have to talk to the Government about the indemnity. Some time after that the prisoner told me that he had an interview with Father Andre, and that he had made peace with the Church. He said that he went to the church with Father Andre, and in the presence of another priest and the Blessed Sacrament he had made peace, and that he would never again do anything against the clergy. Father Andre told him he would use his influence with the Government to obtain for him $35,000. Counsel for the prisoner exploited, for all that it was worth, the argument that Riel came to Canada at the request of others, which was true, and that, having come here, he desired to return to the United States, and would have done so but for the pressure upon him by his friends. This was not true. Witness the evidence of a man who was more in Riel's confidence than anybody else. Charles Nolan. There was a meeting on February 24th when the prisoner was present. Question. What took place at that meeting? Did the prisoner say anything about his departing for the United States? A. Yes. Question. What did the prisoner tell you about that? A. He told me that it would be well to try and make it appear as if they wanted to stop him going to the States. 5 or 6 persons were appointed to go among the people, and when Riel's going away was spoken about, the people were to say no, no. Riel never had any intention of leaving the country. Question. Who instructed the people to do that? A. Riel suggested that himself. Question. Was that put in practice? A. Yes. Question. When did you finally differ from the prisoner in opinion? A. About 20 days before they took up arms. I broke with the prisoner and made open war upon him. Question. What happened on the 19th? A. On March 19th I and the prisoner were to meet to explain the situation. I was taken prisoner by 4 armed men. Question. Did you have occasion to go to the council after that? A. During the night I was brought before the council. Question. Was the prisoner there? A. Yes. Question. What did he say? A. I was brought before the council about 10 o'clock at night. The prisoner made the accusation against me. Question. What did you do? A. I defended myself. Question. What did you say in a few words? A. I proved to the council that the prisoner had made use of the movement to claim the indemnity for his own pocket. Question. Were you acquitted? A. Yes. Question. Were you in the church after that? A. The prisoner protested against the decision of the council. Question. Why did you join the movement? A. To save my life. Question. You were condemned to death? A. Yes. Question. When were you condemned to death? A. When I was made a prisoner. I had been condemned to death when I was brought to the church. It was during the cross-examination of this witness by Mr. Lemieux that the little rift between the prisoner and his counsel became apparent. The witness was about to leave the box when the prisoner spoke. Your Honour, would you permit me a little while? Mr. Justice R. In the proper time. I will tell you when you may speak to me. Not just now, though. Prisoner. If there is any way by legal procedure that I should be allowed to say a word, I wish you would allow me before this witness leaves the box. Mr. Justice R. I think you should suggest any question you have to your own counsel. Prisoner. Do you allow me to say? I have some observation to make before the court. Mr. Fitzpatrick. I don't think this is the proper time, your Honour, that the prisoner should be allowed to say anything on the matter. Mr. Justice R. I should ask him at the close of the case before it goes to the jury. Mr. Fitzpatrick. That is the time to do it. Mr. Justice R. I think you should mention it quietly to your counsel, and if they think it proper for your defence, they will put it. Mr. Fitzpatrick. I think that the time has now arrived when it is necessary to state to the court that we require that the prisoner at the bar should thoroughly understand that anything that is done in this case must be done through us, and if he wishes anything to be done, he must necessarily give us instructions. He should be given to understand that he should give any instructions to us, and he must not be allowed to interfere. He is now endeavouring to withhold instructions. Mr. Justice R. Is there not this difficulty under the statute saying that he shall do so? Mr. Fitzpatrick. I think the statute provides that he may make statements to the jury. Mr. Justice R. The prisoner may defend himself under the statute, personally or by counsel. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Once he has counsel, he has no right to interfere. Mr. Robinson. He has the right to address the jury. Mr. Fitzpatrick. I am not aware of any right, then. Prisoner. If you will allow me, your Honour, this case comes to be extraordinary, and while the Crown, with the great talents they have at its service, are trying to show that I am guilty, of course it is their duty. My counsellors are trying, my good friends and lawyers, who have been sent here by my friends, whom I respect, are trying to show that I am insane. Mr. Justice R: Now you must stop. Prisoner: I will stop and obey your court. Mr. Justice R: I will tell you once more, if you have any questions which you think ought to be put to this witness, and which your advisers have not put, just tell them quietly, and they will put it, if they think it proper to do so. Mr. Fitzpatrick: I don't think he ought to be allowed to say any more. For the last 2 days we have felt ourselves in this position, that this man is actually obstructing the proper management of this case for the express purpose of having a chance to interfere in this case, and he must be given to understand immediately that he won't be allowed to interfere in it, or else it will be absolutely useless for us to endeavour to continue any further in it. Mr. Justice R: Is that a matter that I ought to interfere in? Isn't that a matter entirely between yourself and your client? Suppose you cannot go on, and my ruling was called in question, and the question was raised, and the court allowed such and such a thing to be done? Mr. Fitzpatrick: I don't pretend to argue with the court. It is not my practice, it is not my custom. I have stated to the court what I think of this case. I think the court here is bound by the ordinary rules of law, and so long as the prisoner is represented by counsel, it is his duty to give such instructions to his counsel as to enable him to do his duty to his case. Mr. Justice R: I admit he ought to do so, but suppose he does not, and suppose counsel think fit to throw up their brief. Mr. Fitzpatrick: We are entirely free to do that, and that is a matter of our consideration at the present moment. If the prisoner is allowed to interfere, of course I have to take the ruling of the court. Mr. Justice R: I don't like to dictate to you, but it strikes me that now an opportunity should be taken of ascertaining whether there is really anything that has not been put to this witness that ought to have been put. Mr. Fitzpatrick: We have very little desire to have questions put which we, in our discretion, do not desire to put. What has this court to do with theories about inspiration and the division of lands, further than we have gone into it? However, I, of course, have to accept the ruling of the court as it is given, and then it will be for the counsel for the defence to consider the position. Mr. Robinson: It must be quite understood that no rulings of the court are given with the desire, or at the request, or with the concurrence of the Crown. We have nothing to do in the shape of interference. We must not be drawn into the position that there is a ruling of the court on a question of that kind. I think it would probably be right for the court to ask the prisoner whether the case is or is not fully in the hands of the counsel. It is for the prisoner to say. Mr. Fitzpatrick: We accept that suggestion. Mr. Justice R: Are you defended by counsel? Answer my question, please. Is your case in the hands of counsel? Prisoner: Partly. My case is partly in their hands. Mr. Justice R: Now stop. Are you defended by counsel or not? Have you advisers? Prisoner: I don't wish to leave them aside. I want them. I want their services. But I want my cause, your Honour, to be defended to the best which circumstances allow. Mr. Justice R: Then you must leave it in their hands. Prisoner: I will, if you please, say this reason. My counsel comes from Quebec, from a far province. They have to put questions to men with whom they are not acquainted, on circumstances which they don't know, and although I am willing to give them all the information that I can, they cannot follow the thread of all the questions that can be put to the witnesses. They lose more than 3/4 of the good opportunities of making good answers, not because they are not able. They are learned, they are talented, but the circumstances are such that they cannot put all the questions. If I would be allowed, as it was suggested, this case is extraordinary. Mr. Justice R: You have told me your case is in the hands of the advisers. Prisoner: Partly. Mr. Justice R: Now you must leave it there until you get through. I will give you an opportunity of speaking to the court at the proper time. Prisoner: The witnesses are passing, and the opportunities. Mr. Justice R: Tell your counsel. Prisoner: I cannot all. I have much to say. Mr. Justice R. If there is any question not put to this witness which you think ought to be put, tell it to your counsel, and they will say whether it should be put. Prisoner. I have, on cross-examination, 200 questions. Mr. Robinson. We had better understand this. Counsel for the Crown are taking no part. Our inclination is, if counsel for the prisoner agree to it, to let the prisoner put any question he pleases to the witness. We don't wish to interfere in any way between the prisoner and his counsel. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Would your Honour allow us, say, 5 minutes of a consultation? Mr. Justice R. I was going to suggest that you should take a little time, and that the prisoner should go with you. An adjournment here took place, and on the court reassembling, the conversation was resumed along the original lines. The conference had produced no practical result. Mr. Lemieux explained that although he and his confreres have done their very best to help the prisoner, it appears that he is not very well pleased, or it appears he thinks we did not put all the questions to the witnesses that we should have put. Mr. Robinson interjected. If the prisoner, under the special circumstances of this case, desires to join his counsel in conducting the examination or cross-examination of witnesses, the Crown do not object to it. But the prisoner's counsel were obdurate. As Mr. Lemieux put it, if the prisoner insists upon putting questions to the witnesses, we object to it, and we, moreover, say that we will not continue to act in the case as counsel. We think, however, it is too late for him to now disavow or refuse. It was a hopeless impasse. The prisoner would not discharge his counsel. He would not confide to them the questions that he desired to ask. They would not concede to him the right to ask them himself. And at one time he said, "Here I have to defend myself against the accusation of high treason, or I have to consent to the animal life of an asylum. I don't care much about animal life if I am not allowed to carry with it the moral existence of an intellectual being." Mr. Justice R. Now stop. Prisoner. Yes, your Honour, I will. Mr. Justice R. I think I shall have to tell you that you are in your counsel's hands, and if you and they cannot agree, then will come another question, whether the court will not further interfere and say counsel must go on. The examination of Charles Nolan was then continued, and the witness said that the counsel that condemned him to death was one that was called ex vide. He said that the prisoner had separated entirely from the clergy, that the half-breeds were people who need religion, which had a great influence on their mind. Asked if without religion the prisoner would have succeeded in bringing the half-breeds with him, the witness answered, no, it would never have succeeded. If the prisoner had not made himself appear as a prophet, he would never have succeeded in bringing the half-breeds with him. Mr. Lemieux recross-examined the witness after this. The witness was asked if the prisoner did not lose a great deal of his influence by the fact that he lost the influence of the clergy, and he replied that at the time the prisoner gained influence by working against the clergy and by making himself as priest. Asked if he meant the people did not have confidence in their clergy, he said, no, but they were ignorant, and advantage was being taken of their ignorance and simplicity. Prisoner. I wish to put a question myself to the witness in the box, your Honour. Mr. Justice R. If your counsel see fit to put it, they will put it, and if not, the witness is discharged. Mr. Lemieux. I asked the prisoner if he had any questions to put to the witness through me, and he said he had none, that he would only put questions by himself. Some little further conversation continued along the same lines, and another witness was called. Several papers were produced in court at different times bearing the signature Louis David Riel, ex vide. One was a demand addressed to Major Crozier, commander of the police forts, Carleton and Battleford, calling upon him to surrender his forts to the Provisional Government of the Saskatchewan. Another was addressed to Messrs. Charles Nolan and Maxime Lapine, who were instructed to deliver the first mentioned document. A third was addressed to Major General Middleton and dated May 15th. In order to explain the meaning of the word exovede, I have to refer to the testimony of Captain George Young, of the Winnipeg Field Battery, who received Riel from General Middleton on the evening of May 15, and remained in charge of him until he delivered him to me at Regina on May 23. This witness said, inter alia, "During the term of 8 or 9 days that I was living with him (Riel) entirely, there was an immense amount of conversation. We conversed almost constantly and very freely. He conversed on almost every subject connected with the rebellion. When we found the books and papers in the council room, we found the word exovede. This bothered us a great deal, and one of the first things I asked the prisoner was what it meant. He wrote the meaning of the word in my notebook. It is lengthy." Mr. Greenshields: No matter, let us have it. It is as follows: From two Latin words, ex, which means from, and ovede, flock. That word I made use of to convey that I was assuming no authority at all, and the advisers of the movement took also that title instead of councillors or representatives, and their purpose for doing so was exactly the same as mine, no assumption of authority. Several times, it is true, we made use of the words representative members of the council, but we had to do it until the word exovede was understood and it would begin to become useful amongst even the men of the movement. So the council itself is not a council, being composed of exovedes. We have called the exovedate. In examination in chief, this witness was asked by Mr. Robinson: Question: From first to last of these conversations with you, did you observe anything to arouse a suspicion or indicate that he was of unsound mind? Answer: Not at all, certainly not. I found that I had a mind against my own, and fully equal to it, better educated and much more clever than I was myself. He would stop and evade answering questions with the best possible advantage. In the hands of Mr. Greenshields, the witness acknowledged that he had had no experience in dealing with people of unsound mind, nor had he received a medical education. Question: Do you not consider yourself in a position to give an opinion as to sanity? Answer: I could not give a medical opinion, but I consider that during the 9 days I was living with him I would know if I was living with a lunatic. The next witness whom I call into the witness box of this court of reminiscences is Dr. James M. Wallace, who told Mr. Osier that for about 9 years he had been in charge of the asylum for the insane at Hamilton, Ontario, but had studied insanity for more years than that. He had been present during the sitting of the court, had heard the evidence, had interviewed the prisoner alone for about half an hour, and had discovered no indication of insanity. He thought the prisoner was of sound mind and capable of distinguishing right from wrong. In answer to Mr. Fitzpatrick, the doctor said he had heard of the particular form of mental disease known as megalomania, a term which was scarcely ever used, and that only by one writer. Note: the reader must remember that this was 30 years ago. End note. Question: You are aware that this particular form of insanity is characterised, among other things, by extreme irritability on the part of the patient? Answer: Not megalomania. Megalomania simply applies to grandiose ideas. It can have no other definition than that, and these ideas, allow me to explain, are delusions. They are delusions such as a person holding or believing himself to be king, or possessed of immense wealth, and that the world is at his feet. Question: But you are quite sure that the character of irritability is not one of the characteristics of this malady? Answer: It is not a malady. It is merely a symptom commonly found in paralytic insanity. Question: Where the disease exists, is the idea, the result of disease, fixed and constant? Answer: It is the result of the disease. Question: But is it fixed or intermittent? Answer: In those cases it is fixed. Question: So that when a queen has taken herself to be a queen, she remains a queen? Answer: She usually dies a queen. Question: In her own idea? Answer: Yes. Question: Not sometimes a queen and sometimes otherwise? Answer: No. The witness to be called upon to tell his recollections was Father Alexis Andre Oblate, who had lived with the half-breeds of the Saskatchewan for about 25 years. He was one of the witnesses who were brought from Prince Albert at the expense of the Crown to give evidence in Riel's favour, and Mr. Lemieux tried to extract from him an opinion adverse to the sanity of the prisoner. Question: You have had a good deal of experience with people, and you have known persons who were afflicted with mania? Answer: Before answering that, I want to state a fact to the court regarding the prisoner. You know the life of that man affected us during a certain time. Question: In what way? Answer: He was a fervent Catholic, attending the church and attending to his religious duties frequently, and his state of mind was the cause of great anxiety. In conversation on politics and on the rebellion and on religion he stated things which frightened the priests. I am obliged to visit every month the fathers (priests) of the district. Once all of the priests met together and they put the question, "Is it possible to allow that man to continue in his religious duties?" And they unanimously decided that on this question he was not responsible, that he was completely a fool on this question, and that he could not suffer any contradiction. On the question of religion and politics we considered that he was completely a fool. Mr. Lemieux rather incontinently dropped this witness, who was taken in hand by Mr. Casgrain for the Crown. Question: I believe in the month of December 1884 you had an interview with Riel and Nolan with regard to a certain sum of money which the prisoner claimed from the Federal Government? Answer: Not with Nolan. He was not present. Question: The prisoner was there? Answer: Yes. Question: Will you please state what the prisoner asked from the Federal Government? Answer: I had 2 interviews with the prisoner on that subject. When he made his claim I was there with another gentleman, and he asked from the Government $100,000. We thought that was exorbitant, and the prisoner said, "Wait a little, I will take at once $35,000 cash." Question: And on that condition the prisoner was allowed to leave the country if the Government gave him the $35,000? Answer: Yes, that was the condition he put. Footnote: As we now learn from the late Lord Strathcona's biographer that nobleman himself, when he was plain Donald A. Smith, at the request of Governor Archibald, paid Riel $3,000 to leave the country for the time being, after the rebellion of 1870, and after he had perpetrated the cold-blooded murder of Thomas Scott, and as we learn from the same authority that Archbishop Taché declared that the Government authorized him to promise Riel an amnesty, it is quite evident that there was more method in poor Louis's madness than any of us at that time had any idea of. The same biographer tells us that when the Liberal party came into power after the exposé of the Pacific scandal in 1873, Louis Riel was elected for Provencher and actually travelled to Ottawa for the purpose of being sworn in a member of the House of Commons. At this time he was a fugitive from justice. He succeeded in taking the oath and in writing his name in the book. In the hurry and confusion of the moment he was allowed to slip away from the house undetected. No one seemed to bother about him greatly, and he was, accordingly, permitted to escape. It would have meant the saving of a little blood and a good deal of treasure, but the development of the Great Lone Land would have been delayed for at least a generation. End footnote. Question: When was this? Answer: On December 23rd, 1884. Question: There was also another interview between you and the prisoner? Answer: There have been about 20 interviews between us. Question: He was always after you to ask you to use your influence with the Federal Government to obtain this indemnity? Answer: The first time he spoke of it was on December 12th. He had never spoken a word about it before, and on December 23rd he spoke about it again. Question: Is it not true that the prisoner told you he himself was the half-breed question? Answer: He did not say so in express terms, but he conveyed that idea. He said, "If I am satisfied, the half-breeds will be." I must explain this. This objection was made to him, that even if the Government granted him the $35,000, The half-breed question would remain the same, and he said in answer to that, "If I am satisfied, the half-breeds will be." Q. Is it not a fact that he told you he would even accept a less sum than the $35,000? A. Yes, he said, "Use all the influence you can, you may get all that, but get all that you can, and if you get less we will see." End of chapter 16, part 2. Part 3 of Mounted Police Life in Canada. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mounted Police Life in Canada by Captain Burton, Deane. Chapter 16, Part 3. Louis Riel, executed for treason. Mr. Osler's cross-examination of the next witness was of absorbing interest. Dr. Francois Roy was one of the prisoner's witnesses from Quebec, whose expenses were paid by the Government. He told Mr. Fitzpatrick that for more than 15 or 16 years he had been medically superintendent of the lunatic asylum at Beauport in Quebec, and it had been his duty to visit the principal asylums in the United States and see how the patients were treated there. He had made a special study of diseases of the brain. He said that the prisoner was an inmate of the asylum for about 19 months prior to January 1878, suffering from megalomania and passing under the name of La Rochelle. He was placed therein by the Provincial Government of Quebec. In reply to Mr. Fitzpatrick, the doctor said, "I am perfectly certain that when the prisoner was under our care he was not of sound mind, but he became cured before he left, more or less. But from what I heard here to day, I am ready to say that I believe on these occasions his mind was unsound, and that he was labouring under the disease so well described by Dagonet." In cross-examination, Mr. Osler elicited from the witness that he was one of 2 proprietors of a private asylum, having an average of from 800 to 900 inmates. He said they had a medical superintendent and a treasurer. Q. The proprietors only have a general supervision? A. More than that. I myself am a specialist. The doctor admitted that he had brought no books or papers. Before starting he had looked into the register to refresh his memory as to the date of La Rochelle's discharge, and for the rest said, "I thought they would ask me my opinion of the case." Having satisfied his legitimate curiosity on matters in general connected with the conduct of the institution, Mr. Osler came at length to the disease and its characteristics in this wise. Q. You say the main feature of this disease is what? What is the leading feature of this disease, do you say? Do you say that it is a fixed idea, incapable of change? A. That is one thing I may say. Q. Will you answer the question? Do you say that the leading feature of the disease is a fixed idea incapable of a change by reason? A. I did not succeed in changing. Q. I ask you, is that the leading feature of the disease? A. That is one of the features. Q. Is it the leading feature? A. It is one of them. It is one of the characteristic features. Q. A fixed idea with a special ambition incapable of change by reasoning? A. Yes, we did not succeed in changing the idea of the patient. Q. Well, that fixed idea is beyond his control? A. I would not be prepared to say entirely. Q. If it is beyond his control, he is an insane man? A. Yes. Q. Is not this fixed idea beyond his control? A. Yes. Q. If within his control, it is an indication of sanity? A. That he was trying to get better. He may have had intermissions in which he understood his condition. Q. It is subject to control. It is not a fixed idea. That is what we have agreed upon as the leading characteristic. Do you understand? A. I do not know what you are after. Q. If this idea is subject to control, then this man is sane. A. There may be intermissions when he can control himself, because then the insanity disappears. Q. And then there is a lucid interval? A. Yes. Q. During the period of the insanity, the idea possesses the man and it is not controllable? A. No. Q. Is that the leading feature of the disease? A. Partly. Q. Do you know of any other? A. I am not an expert in insanity. Q. Can you give me any other leading feature of the disease? A. I have no other feature to give. Q. That is the only one you can describe? A. I gave you the features and characteristics of the disease well enough. Q. I am going to keep you to that unless you want to enlarge upon it. I am going to build my theory upon that. You can enlarge it as much as you like now, but do not go back upon me afterwards. Is there any other leading feature of the disease? A. I have given you the principal characteristics of his disease. Q. I want to get the particular characteristics of this form of mania. A. They have intermissions, sometimes for months and sometimes for days. The least contradiction excites them. Q. There is a class of healthy intermissions. Sometimes a man likes beer and sometimes whiskey. I want to get the characteristics that distinguish him from a healthy man, not those that we have in common with the insane. A. We always answer reasonably, but when a man comes and pretends to know everything and talks nonsense, we suspect that, to a certain extent, he has lost his reason. Q. We want to get at the leading characteristic. You have given us one feature. Is there only the one feature? If there are any other features, say so. A. I won't give you any. Q. Will you stick to it? A. Yes. Q. Then what leading idea, not subject to change by reason, is it that you have fixed upon in the evidence yesterday and today, bringing you to the conclusion that he is of unsound mind? A. It is because of some symptoms. Q. Tell me the symptoms that bring you to the conclusion that this man is within the rule you have laid down. Tell me the facts that bring him within that rule. A. The facts are that he has always kept that characteristic. Q. Answer that question. Mr. Fitzpatrick: The witness has been speaking in English for some time past. If the witness does not understand the questions properly, he should answer the questions in French. Mr. Osier: If the man wants to hide himself under the French, he can do so. Q. You understand what I mean? A. Parlez-moi français? Mr. Osier: It will be for the jury to say whether he is making the change at his own suggestion or at that of the counsel on the other side. Q. Having given a rule to test this insanity, what fact is there disclosed in the evidence which leads you to say that the prisoner comes within the rule? A. That part of the evidence given by the clergy today shows in a positive manner that the prisoner has manifested symptoms that we meet with in megalomania. Q. That is no answer to my question. I want the fact on which you bring the prisoner within the rule that you have laid down. I want to take the fact proved by the evidence. Q. Tell me the fact on which you rely. A. The prisoner gets this theory from the idea that he has a mission. Q. Do you understand that to be the fixed idea, not controllable by reason? A. I believe so, because reason has never so far succeeded in changing the idea that he has. Q. Is that the only reason you have for saying that the prisoner is insane? A. It is, and I believe it to be sufficient. Q. Is it consistent with labouring under an idea not controllable by reason that he would abandon that idea for $35,000? Mr. Fitzpatrick: I object to that. That has not been proved. His Honour: What is the question? Mr. Osier: Is it consistent with a man having an idea not controllable by reason that he will abandon the idea for $35,000? Let that be a hypothetical question. Mr. Fitzpatrick: I object to the question. His Honour: He can put hypothetical questions. Mr. Osier: My learned friend must know that the question is regular, and should not interfere at a critical part of the examination so as to give the witness a cue. Mr. Fitzpatrick: I did not have any such intention. We have the right to object, and intend to exercise that right. Mr. Osier: You should not exercise it in such a way as to give the witness a cue. That is the second cue that you have given the witness. You gave him a cue in regard to speaking French. It would be unprofitable to follow Dr. Roy's evidence any further. He was hopelessly out of his depth, and his counsel had to do something desperate to save his face. When, in order to evade answering a question, he told Mr. Osier that he was not an expert in insanity, a good many people who heard him wondered what he was doing there at all. Mr. Osier finally dismissed him with a gesture of great contempt, and in these words: "Well, doctor, if you will not answer the question in French or in English, I may as well let you go. You can go." He then turned his broad back upon him, and the doctor stepped blithely out of the box as if he were a hero. Father Vital Fourmond was another of the prisoner's witnesses, brought from Prince Albert at the expense of the Crown. It was he who consulted the other Reverend Fathers as to whether Riel should be allowed to continue in his religious duties. He told Mr. Lemieux that Riel had extraordinary ideas on the subject of the Trinity. The only God was God the Father, and God the Son was not God. The Holy Ghost was not God either. The second person of the Trinity was not God, and, as a consequence of this, the Virgin Mary was not the Mother of God, but the Mother of the Son of God. Instead of saying, "Hail Mary, Mother of God," he said, "Hail Mary, Mother of the Son of God." He did not admit the doctrines of the Church of the Divine Presence. As to his political ideas, he wanted first to go to Winnipeg and Lower Canada and the United States and even France. He said he will take your country even, and then he was to go to Italy and overthrow the Pope, and then he would choose another Pope of his own making. Mr. Lemieux: Have you made up your mind about the prisoner being insane as far as religious matters are concerned? Father F: We were much embarrassed at first, because sometimes he looked reasonable and sometimes he looked as a man who did not know what he was saying. Mr. Lemieux: Finally? Father F: We made up our minds that there was no way to explain his conduct but that he was insane. Otherwise he would have been too big a criminal. Father Fourmond gave this evidence on July 30th as a witness for the defence. He was somewhat less guarded on August 7 following, when he made an affidavit appealing for mercy on behalf of Philip Carnot, Maxime Lafime, Moisey Ouellet, Pierre Perentneau, Emmanuel Champagne, and Philip Carnot, all of whom I firmly believe, so the affidavit runs, were kept in the rebel camp through terror of their own lives and for fear of their families being punished should they attempt to escape. The following extracts from the same affidavit: To impress the people and keep them within his power, this man, Riel, reverted to all kinds of trickery. Often have I seen him praying aloud, prostrating himself in prayer, and ordering all the others to do so. Then he made a deep impression on his poor, ignorant dupes, and so convinced them of his divine mission that it was impossible to convince them that he was a trickster, and would lead them to destruction. Riel so played on their ignorance that he made them believe in his power to work miracles. They firmly believed this. I heard them say that Riel could make it thunder and could cure disease without medicines. Riel himself declared that he was once the victim of an incurable disease of the heart, but that on May 24th he had cured the disease by his divine power. He also declared that if he should be killed it did not matter, he would be with them again alive, and that would prove to them his divine mission. He cried, "It is the Holy Ghost that speaks. Who shall dare disbelieve me? Oh, my poor people!" I could not restrain them. They were under the infatuation of this arch traitor and trickster till he got them committed by the effusion of blood. I heard him say and proclaim, "Death, death, death to any one who tries to desert." And many of the poor people had guns pointed at their hearts by Riel's orders, because he suspected them of wishing to get away, and to complete his terrorism over the poor people, he declared it to be his determination to put me, this deponent, in the front of the battle. This affidavit, of which I have quoted a very small part, is interesting as showing that a week's further reflection was sufficient to bring the Reverend Father to the conclusion that, after all, criminality and not insanity was the preponderating weight in the scale. The insanity plea was ridiculous from the first. What did a couple of partisan doctors, hurriedly imported from the East, after one or two brief interviews, know about the prisoner and the state of his mind compared with us who were in daily communication with him? It was no uncommon thing for us to have lunatics in our charge, and very skilful and sympathetic treatment they used to receive at the hands of Dr. Jukes, the senior surgeon of the force. He was in daily communication with Louis Riel in the discharge of his duties, and never had any reason to suspect him of insanity. Nor had I, nor had Sergeant Pichot, the provost in charge of the prison, and we had had the prisoner in custody for over 2 months. I was asked at the trial if I had ever seen anything to indicate that the prisoner was not of sound mind, and I replied, "Nothing whatever." Question: Anything to indicate the contrary? Answer: Yes, I think so. He always gave me the impression of being very shrewd. As I left the witness box to return to my place in court, I had to pass the dock, and as I did so, Riel said to me, "Thank you, Captain," and he meant it. He particularly resented the imputation of insanity, and did not seem to realise that it was the one hope of saving his life. I have no doubt in my own mind that if Father Fourmond had laid an information before a justice of the peace that Louis Riel was insane and dangerous to be at large, and had adduced in corroboration of his complaint some of the evidence which he embodied in his affidavit before mentioned, the accused man would have been committed to one of our grand rooms for temporary detention, pending inquiry and observation. This was not done, and as Father Fourmond and his confreres held their peace, the outside world knew nothing of the prisoner's eccentricities as alleged. If the matter had been brought to the notice of the Mounted Police, they would have been glad of an opportunity to remove this firebrand, and would have attended to it, but in truth insanity was never mentioned in connection with Riel's name until his counsel originated the idea at the trial. Mr. Fitzpatrick made a long and very able address on behalf of his client, and at the close thereof the prisoner was informed by the court that if he had any remarks to make to the jury, then was the time to speak. This is a special privilege accorded by statute to a person charged with high treason, and before Riel opened his mouth, Mr. Lemieux told the court that his counsel must not be considered responsible for any declaration he might make. Riel made a long, rambling speech, from which it is not an easy matter to make extracts. The following is, however, material to the question of sanity or otherwise. "Today, when I saw the glorious General Middleton bearing testimony that he thought I was not insane, and when Captain Deane proved that I am not insane, I felt that God was blessing me and blotting away from my name the blot resting upon my reputation on account of having been in the lunatic asylum of my good friend Dr. Roy. I have been in an asylum, but I thank the lawyers for the Crown who destroy the testimony of my good friend Dr. Roy, because I have always believed that I was put in the asylum without good reason. Even if I was going to be sentenced by you gentlemen of the jury, I have this satisfaction if I die, that if I die I will not be reputed by all men as insane, as a lunatic. A good deal has been said by the two Reverend Fathers, Andre and Fourmond. I cannot call them my friends, but they made no false testimony. I know that a long time ago they believed me more or less insane. As to religion, what is my belief? What is my insanity about that? My insanity, your honour, gentlemen of the jury, is that I wish to leave Rome aside, inasmuch as it is the cause of division between Catholics and Protestants. The 19th century is to be treated in certain ways, and it is probably for that reason I have found the word exovede. I prefer to be called one of the flock. I am no more than you are. I am simply one of the flock, equal to the rest. If it is any satisfaction to the doctors to know what kind of insanity I have, if they are going to call my pretensions insanity, I say humbly, through the grace of God, I believe I am the prophet of the New World." Mr. Robinson closed the case for the Crown in a magnificent speech, and freely castigated the counsel of the other side who preceded him. I should explain here that we had in the barracks at that time some 50 half-breeds and Indian prisoners, including Poundmaker, the Indian chief, and these men were all awaiting trial for treason felony. Mr. Robinson said, among other things, "It will not be necessary to go over the evidence in detail, for a reason we seldom find in cases of this kind. There is no contradiction, there is no dispute, there is not a single witness whose word has been doubted, there is not a single fact proved on the part of the Crown which anybody has been called to contradict, and it stands, therefore, as an admission, and an admission made by counsel for the defence, that the case as presented has been made out beyond all question. What my learned friends' addresses amount to was practically this. They told you, in fact, that this rebellion was justifiable. My learned friend, Mr. Greenshields, told you that the men responsible for the blood that was shed were the people who had refused the petitions which the half-breeds made under the direction and guidance of the prisoner at the bar. In the next breath he told you that this rebellion was directed and carried on by an irresponsible lunatic. My learned friends must make their choice between their defences. They cannot claim for their client what is called a niche in the Temple of Fame, and at the same time assert that he is entitled to a place in a lunatic asylum. What, in reality, is the defence which you, as sensible men, are fixed to find by your verdict? You are asked to find that 600 or 700 men may get up an armed rebellion, with its consequent loss of life, its loss of property, that murder and arson and pillage may be committed by that band of armed men, and we are to be told that they are all irresponsible lunatics. It is my duty to put these facts to you plainly and strongly, because it is our duty to protect society. And all that I can say is that, if such folly as finding this man insane is possible in this country, you say in effect to men who desire to come here to live that there is no sufficient protection by law for either life, property, or liberty. Are you prepared to say that? Because that is the single issue placed before you by the counsel for the Crown. Disguise it as you like, speak of it as you like, that is the simple result and the plain consequence. My learned friend, Mr. Fitzpatrick, must have forgotten what is due to a prisoner when he charged those who were acting for the Crown with some warmth for not having called Poundmaker to prove the receipt of that document. Note: that is the letter signed by Riel, found in Poundmaker's camp. He was good enough at the same time to say that those who were conducting the case for the Crown were persons who understood fair play. It was because we did understand fair play, because it would have been improper to have called Poundmaker to swear to that we did not call him. If we had attempted to put Poundmaker in the box to prove the receipt of this document, we would have been asking Poundmaker to declare on oath his own complicity in this rebellion, and Poundmaker would have said to us, "I decline to answer your questions," and any judge would have said to those who acted for the Crown, "Gentlemen, you had no business to put a man in that position." Now that it is our answer on the part of the Crown to the charge that we did not call the prisoners to prove their own guilt out of their own mouths, those who are guilty of this rebellion, and those who have not a proper excuse, have taken the step upon their own heads, and they must suffer the punishment which the law from all time, and which the law for the last 5 centuries, has declared to be punishment of the crime of treason. The case was left to the jury in a very full charge, and the law, as regards the defence of insanity, clearly stated in a manner to which no exception was taken either at the trial or in the Court of Queen's Bench of Manitoba or before the Privy Council. The jury brought in a verdict of guilty, with a recommendation to mercy, and were discharged. The prisoner was asked if he had anything to say why sentence should not be pronounced upon him, and made a very long, rambling speech, after which he was sentenced to be executed at Regina on September 18th. An appeal was taken to the Court of Appeal in Manitoba and also to the Privy Council, but the judgment was affirmed by both courts. Riel, after his sentence, was not long in attending to his spiritual affairs, and was then received once more into the bosom of the Church. Before this could be done, however, he had to recant his errors, which he did in a long manuscript document dated the 4th day of August, and of which a translation is as follows: Renunciation made by Mr. Louis Riel, whose name is also David Riel, of all his errors, in the presence of the Reverend Father Fourmond, Oblate of Mary Immaculate, his Father Confessor, the 4th day of August, 1885. I, the undersigned, Louis Riel, being in full possession of my faculties and of my free will, without any other motive than to ensure my eternal salvation, in reconciling myself with the God whom I have offended, and to amend the scandals which I have been so unhappy as to cause, do solemnly abjure all the errors which I have believed, professed, and taught contrary to the doctrine of the Holy Apostolic and Roman Church, beseeching her, in the person of her charitable ministers, to bestow upon me her holy absolution for all my crimes and iniquities, as I renounce my false mission of prophet, the prime cause of my errors and of all other backslidings. I particularly abjure my sins against the most holy and adorable Trinity, against the divine motherhood of the august and immaculate Mother of God, against the most holy and adorable Eucharist, against the eternal punishment of hell, against the infallibility of the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church of Rome, and of her visible head, the Holy Father the Pope, against the authority and integrity of divine inspiration of the Holy Scriptures and of the Catholic tradition, against the Apostolic institution of the Sabbath day. I believe with all my heart and with my mouth freely and fervently confess that there is one God in 3 persons, consubstantial and perfectly equal in all things, that is to say, that the Father is God, the Son is God, like unto the Father, begotten by him from all eternity, consubstantial with his Almighty Father, eternal, infinitely perfect, like unto himself, who, when he, the divine Son of God, abased himself so as to make himself like unto us, except as to sin, took our likeness upon him in the womb of the blessed and immaculate Virgin Mary, ever a virgin by the operation of the Holy Spirit, and consequently mother of the person who is God, Mother of God, according to the Catholic faith, solemnly confirmed at the Ecumenical Council of Ephesus. I believe, therefore, that there are 2 natures in Jesus Christ our Lord, the divine nature and the human nature, although he can only be one person, the person of the Son of God. He is perfect God and perfect man, so that when he says that his Father is greater than himself, it is not the teaching of the Holy Catholic Church that he is not holy man and holy God. I further believe that the Holy Ghost, the 3rd person of the most holy and adorable Trinity, is God, like unto God the Father and the Son, proceeding from the Father and the Son, being one God with the Father and the Son. I believe in the 7 sacraments of the Holy Church, and more particularly that an ordained priest only can hear the confession of Christians and give them holy absolution. That the Blessed Eucharist is a sacrament instituted by our Lord Jesus Christ in his abundant love for us, and that it contains in verity and truth his body, blood, soul, and divinity, under the holy species of bread and wine, living in that adorable sacrament not only for this mortal and temporal life, but more for the glorious and eternal life, enjoying in his body and in his Holy Spirit all the priceless treasures of his triumphant resurrection. I believe in the infallibility of the Church and of our Holy Father the Pope, speaking ex cathedra, and as the lawful successor of St. Peter, in his supremacy over all other bishops, of whom he is the one visible head on earth, as well as in his authority and jurisdiction over all priests and the faithful, believing that to him, as to Peter, it was said, Feed my sheep, feed my lambs. I believe in the eternity of the pains of hell, that they will forever endure and never cease, purgatory alone having temporal punishment proportioned to trespasses against divine justice. I believe that the Holy Sabbath day is at least an apostolic institution designed to replace the Sabbath of the ancient law, and that, consequently, the divine obligation to keep it holy is as binding upon us as was the obligation with regards to the ancient Jewish Sabbath, abolished by the new dispensation. Most humbly I solicit pardon from the public at large, particularly from the venerable representatives of the Holy Catholic Church, from the representatives of the civil power, and all my Christian brethren, for the scandalous offences which I have committed against God and His ordinances, commending myself to the pity of all men, and particularly so to that of the Almighty God, whom I have set at naught. Signed, Louis Riel, or Louis David Riel. Witness, V. Fourmond, OMI. Witness, L. Cuchin, OMI. Riel asked to see me one day, and handed me the document of which the foregoing purports to be a translation. So far as I recollect now, a recantation in the foregoing form had been presented to him by the priest for acceptance and signature, and he stipulated that he should be allowed to make a copy of it. This copy he then entrusted to me, asking me to keep it. Why, I do not know. He did not ask me to publish it, or I would not have received it, for it was not a time in the country's history when it would have been advisable to add fuel to the fire. Having explained what the foregoing document was, he then handed me another paper, which was to be signed in my presence by the two priests, Father Fourmond and Cuchin, and was witnessed by myself. This document also was to remain in my custody. A translation of it reads as follows: We, the undersigned, certify as witnesses the authenticity of the answers made by Louis David Riel, and of his recantation, and of the authenticity of the document of his renunciation, and we declare ourselves responsible before God and man for the legitimacy of the questions which we have put to him, and for the legitimacy of the recantation which we have required from him as ordained priests. Regina Prison, 7th August 1885. SD. V. Fourmond, OMI. SD. L. Cuchin, OMI. Witness, R. Burton, Deane, Superintendent, Northwest Mounted Police. He made a great point of my witnessing this document, and I did so, although I did not want to be involved in any matter which might give possible offence to the priests. Similarly, I did not want to give offence to a moribund man, and accepted both papers from him accordingly. After a lapse of 30 years, I presume there is no harm in publishing historical documents. I never discussed religious subjects with Riel. The only occasion on which he ventured to obtrude his pretensions on me was November 14th, 1885, 2 days before his execution, and long after the recantation of his errors, when he sent me a note by the orderly officer, written by himself, which purports to be: The narration of a vision as seen this evening, 14th November 1885, by Louis David Riel, Prophet of the New World, care of Mr. the Inspector Dowling. On the other side of a half page of foolscap was written: Captain R. B. Deane. A little before half past 8 o'clock this evening, as I knelt down to make the way of the cross, my eyes being shut, while I was beginning to pray, and being turned towards the west, I saw before me, at a distance of about 20 or 25 yards, a man, dark complexion, black moustache. It struck me that it was the Honourable Hector Langevin. While I was considering his face, his features changed, and reminded me the decomposed features of the late Sir George E. Cartier, and he disappeared. An instant after, my mind was in doubt whether those features were not those of the Honourable Minister of Militia. The before mentioned appeals to the Manitoba Court and the Privy Council had necessitated the postponement of the execution, and it was not until November 15th that the Commissioner of Dominion Police brought the death warrant from Ottawa. We had known, of course, that it was on the way, and arrangements had been made for the morning of November 16th at 8 o'clock. Riel was informed by Sheriff Chapleau of the arrival of the warrant at about 9 p.m. on the 15th, and said in reply, "I am glad that at last I am to be released from suffering." The strain upon him during the previous 3 months had been tremendous, and he had become constitutionally weaker, although his mental condition was unchanged. He was attended at the last by Fathers Andre and McWilliams, and died with the courage of a man and a Christian, and it was not possible to doubt his sanity. He had asked that his body should be given to his friends to be laid at rest in St. Boniface, the French cemetery across the Red River from Manitoba, and we handed it over to a Mr. Bonneau upon an order from the Lieutenant Governor for conveyance thither. While the coffin was thus awaiting transfer to Mr. Bonneau, it was kept in a corner of the prison yard, and while there, report was made to me that a rumour was in circulation that after the dead man had been cut down from the scaffold, a brutal mounted policeman had, to the accompaniment of a blasphemous oath, stamped his booted foot into the dead man's face as it lay on the ground. It seems now, as I write these words after the lapse of more than a quarter of a century, that it is almost incredible that such an improbable, senseless story should have obtained currency, but it is to be borne in mind that race prejudices and passions were running high, that the neighbourhood was seething with excitement, and that it was impossible to allow the body to pass out of our possession until the falsity of this report had been demonstrated beyond all question. Colonels Irvine and Macleod were both in barracks, as were Superintendent Gagnon and Dr. Jukes, and I took them all across to the prison yard and had the coffin opened. Gagnon was a native of Quebec, so it was very fortunate that he was able to be there. As was expected, there was no trace of any disfigurement of any kind. A few locks of hair had been taken from the brow, but this had not been done by any unsympathetic hand, and the lie that had found its way into circulation was killed in its infancy. If this had not been done, we should never have heard the end of it. I will close the story of Louis Riel, so far as his life came into conjunction with mine, by reproducing a poem which he handed to me on July 13th, 1885, and which I believe was his own composition.
Jésus, Marie, Joseph, sauvez-nous, intercédez pour nous, priez pour nous. Béni soit Dieu qui glorifie le règne de Victoria. C'est en Dieu que je me confie, puisque c'est lui qui me créa. Dieu veuille que la reine voie l'éclat des plus beaux cheveux blancs, et qu'elle avance dans la joie du plus gracieux de ses ans. Fasse Jésus-Christ qu'elle atteigne ce grand âge qui n'est pas vieux, où la grâce des années règne plus en remontant vers les cieux. Plaise à Jésus-Christ qu'elle vive pour le moins encore 20 ans, que sa majesté soit active, en bonne santé, tout le temps. Qu'elle aime, mais sans préférence, le peuple canadien-français, que toute la Nouvelle-France trouve auprès d'elle un libre accès. Sous son admirable couronne, sous son règne majestueux, puissante race anglo-saxonne, rendez les Irlandais heureux. Que Jésus, le Fils de Dieu même, fasse étinceler sur les mers et les terres le diadème de la reine dans l'univers. Au bureau du commissionnaire à Regina, 12 juillet 1885. Dédié à Monsieur le capitaine R. B. Deane. Complimentary for my being allowed to write in the Commissioner's office.
End of chapter 16, part 3. Part 1 of Mounted Police Life in Canada. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mounted Police Life in Canada by Captain Burton, Deane. Chapter 17, Part 1. 3 Trials for Murder. The Tucker Peach Murder, 1910. The Benson Murder and Arson, 1913. The Wilson Murder and Robbery, 1914. The Tucker Peach Murder. On June 29, 1910, a dead body was reported to have been found in the Bow River, not far from the Roman Catholic Industrial School at Durbow. A coroner was notified, and, in company with a mounted police constable from Okotoks, visited the spot the following day. The body had been washed against the trunk of a fallen tree in the river. Part of it, which was out of the water, was very much discoloured, and the whole of it was considerably decomposed. When brought to land, there was found to be no head on the body. A shirt and undershirt were all the clothing, and these gave no clue to the identity of the man who had come to so untimely an end. No one was known to be missing, and after a somewhat perfunctory examination, the coroner issued his order for burial, and the remains were buried on the river bank by a couple of nearby settlers who volunteered to do the work. It happened that my wife and I were at this time on a month's holiday in British Columbia, and it was not until the month of November following that I first heard of the occurrence. In the course of that month a long distance telephone message informed me that a skull had been found in the bed of the river just under the tree where the body had been discovered, and that a hole in the forehead indicated foul play. Detective Sergeant Murison was sent to the spot. He found the skull as stated, and close to it, half buried in the sand, a blanket, cowhide, and 2 pieces of rope. These were matted together and frozen solid, and it took a long time to thaw them out. The skull had a small, clean hole in the centre of the forehead, such a hole as could only have been made by a bullet, a piece of cotton batting in one of the ears, and a slight dent, apparently the mark of an old injury received during lifetime some years previously, which extended both ways across the forehead from the centre. Obviously, the first thing to do was to find a name for the dead man, and to take that as a starting point for further inquiries. Gradually it transpired that one of the earliest settlers in that sparsely settled district, a man who had been settled there for upwards of a quarter of a century, had, earlier in the year, disappeared in a mysterious sort of way. That is to say, he had gone away without saying good-bye to sundry neighbours, who were surprised at his omission to go and see them before he left. It was common talk that he had sold his place and his horses to a young fellow who had taken possession, but this unceremonious departure, without a word, rankled in the minds of the neighbours, because there was no reason for it, and they could not understand it. The absentee's name was A.C. Tucker Peach, but he was popularly known as Old Tucker. A few neighbours, those who knew him, said from the first that the skull, with its few iron grey hairs, its missing teeth and general contour, looked like Old Tucker. One witness subsequently deposed how the deceased man came by the wound on the forehead when a horse had kicked him in his own stable many years previously, and how he had helped dress the wound. The same witness said, speaking of the iron grey hair, "Many a time I've cut it," with the suspicion of a tear glimmering in his eye. The skull was sent to the provincial bacteriologist at Edmonton for examination, and very masterly treatment it received at the hands of Dr. Revell. The body, which had been buried on the Bow River bank in June, was exhumed, but the cleansing and thawing of it for the examination took several days, and nothing was said about it at the inquest, which was opened on November 29th at Okotoks. Dr. Revell showed the coroner's jury how a bullet had entered the skull at the forehead, and after a somewhat eccentric course had emerged at the inside corner of the left eye. He told the same story to 2 other juries later on, and they all believed him. The inquest was called for November 29th, 1911, and on November 28th our position was this: we believed that we had evidence enough to convince the jury that the body was Tucker Peach's, and that he had been murdered by a bullet wound in the head, but as to how or by whom the fatal shot had been fired, we were in complete ignorance. We had not, however, been idle since the finding of the skull on November 12th. We had been searching high and low for Tucker Peach, and making inquiries as to his business relations with T. M. Robertson, the young man to whom he was alleged to have sold out. Robertson at that time was working as a brakesman on the Canadian Pacific Railway between Calgary and Medicine Hat, and we found ourselves depending exclusively on him for any intelligence whatever respecting his deal. Robertson had left word with the postmaster at Gladys to forward to his care at his Calgary address any mail that might arrive for Tucker Peach, and a report had in some manner become circulated that Tucker Peach had written to him from England, where it was known that he had a sister living. On being served with a summons to attend the inquest, Robertson told us that he had bought the Peach Ranch of 160 acres for $26 per acre, half down, half payable in 12 months, that after the deal was made Peach went to Carstairs, and from there to England, and that in the month of September Peach had written to him asking how he would be able to meet the remainder of the payment. Immediately on receipt of this report I sent a non-commissioned officer to Carstairs, but no trace of the missing man could be found there. Robertson was interviewed as soon as he returned to Calgary from Medicine Hat, and told a slightly different story. He said now that he had paid $1,000 down by a cheque on the Bank of Montreal, Calgary, and that the transfer had been drawn up by Peach's lawyer. He said that he had received his money by means of a draft from P. Coates and Company, and that Tucker Peach had written to him from Lancashire, where his sister was living. The transfer, he said, he had left at Medicine Hat, and he did not know the name of the lawyer who had drawn it. We ascertained without difficulty that his account of his monetary transactions was fictitious, but beyond that we had nothing to warrant our depriving him of his liberty, and my men had positive instructions to say nothing which might alarm him at all. Another report as to Peach's whereabouts, namely that he was in Stettler, was investigated and found to be untrue. There was nothing for it but to wait and see what the inquest might bring forth. On the day before the inquest was due to be held, Robertson duly started by train for Okotoks, about 30 miles from Calgary, but instead of stopping there went on to Macleod, some 80 miles further south. Arriving at Macleod in the afternoon, he went to a sporting house, where he gradually became maudlin under the influence of liquor, and eventually said that he was escaping from the police, that he had stolen about $75,000 in Alaska, that the police were after him, and that he wanted to catch the Spokane Flyer that night. The woman of the house wrote a note to the officer commanding the mounted police at Macleod, and Robertson was gathered into the fold. At the guard room, where he was searched, the summons to the inquest was found on his person, a coroner's warrant was applied for and issued, and Robertson was presented in custody at Okotoks next day. He was feeling very much the results of his potations of the previous day, and was in no condition to withstand the gruelling examination which he was called upon to undergo. In the witness box he told a story different from any of his previous stories. He said now that he had bought 2 quarter sections from Tucker Peach, being 320 acres at $26 an acre, which price included the 20 horses on the place. This purchase money, to the extent of $5,000, had come to him by bank draft from Scotland to the Bank of Montreal at Calgary, where he cashed it for notes and gold. He did not remember the respective amounts of each, and so the silly story went on, until at last he was informed that the Bank of Montreal officials could and would be called to contradict his statements in detail, and he was asked if he had any explanations to offer as to the conflict of evidence between himself and them. His answer to that was, "Well, I guess this is not the place to say it. I do not wish to say anything further." Inspector Duffus, the officer who was watching the case for the police, saw that the psychological moment had arrived. He obtained the coroner's permission to speak to the witness, asked the latter if he had anything he would like to say to him privately, and, on an affirmative gesture, took him to another part of the house. There, having given the prisoner the full caution enjoined by the Criminal Code in presence of witnesses, he wrote down Robertson's confession and asked him to sign it, which he did. The confession briefly set forth that on the morning of King Edward's funeral, Robertson and one John Fisk had murdered Tucker Peach in his own shack, that they had wrapped the body in the dead man's blanket and cowhide, and with his own wagon and horses had carried it into the middle of the stream. The jury, of course, brought in a verdict accordingly, and the question was how to arrest John Fisk before he could be warned by his sympathisers. It happened that he had recently bought a livery stable in a new place called Carbon, about 75 miles from Calgary, in a northeasterly direction. It was after 10 o'clock before I had heard and digested the reports made by the returning inquest party, and there was no time to lose. We had a detachment at Carbon, but the wires were down, and we could not communicate with them, in addition to which there was the possibility that both men might be away from home on patrol, so there was only one thing to be done. Soon after midnight of November 29th, the most powerful motor that I could hire in Calgary, containing 2 non-commissioned officers, crept quietly out of the city on its 75 miles run to Carbon. The men had positive orders to wait for the opening up of the stable in the morning and to take Fisk while he was engaged in his work, for he was well known to be a desperate man who would not scruple to use firearms if he had a chance. The arrest was effected without difficulty, and the motor discharged its passengers into barracks in Calgary by 1 p.m. of November 30th. 13 hours at $5 per hour paid the motorman's account. Now that the 2 perpetrators of the murder were secured, there was obviously only one course to pursue in order to convict both men, namely, to use Robertson's evidence against Fisk and Robertson's confession against himself. Robertson never weakened in the stand that he had taken. On the contrary, he seemed to be anxious to tell all he knew. A great load seemed to have been lifted off his mind, and he never was dull or dispirited from first to last. He told the cross-examining counsel at Fisk's preliminary hearing that he was not afraid to meet his God, and even later, 10 days before his execution was due to take place, before the news of his reprieve had been received, a fellow prisoner remarked of him that he was cracking jokes and laughing, and did not seem to realise at all the terrible position in which he was standing. But I am anticipating. Only one person was allowed to talk to him, and that was the officer to whom he confessed at the time of the inquest. To him, after he had been a day or 2 in the guardroom, he, Robertson, made an amplified statement, and this revealed such an extraordinary state of affairs that I reproduced it as it was given. This was not used in court, of course, and was intended for our guidance in hunting up corroborations of the story of an accomplice. As to the law on that very important point, I had, many years ago, to wit, in the month of November 1889, clipped from the Weekly Times and pasted in one of my textbooks a little nugget of wisdom enunciated by the President of the Parnell Commission on Wednesday, November 13, 1889. There had been a conversation between the President and Sir Henry James as to the principle of law governing the admission of an accomplice's evidence, and the President disposed of it in these words: "I rather regard it as a doctrine of expediency and prudence than a principle of law. Juries are strongly recommended not to act upon the uncorroborated evidence of an accomplice, but it has never been a rule of law. I may add that the corroboration required is only of the surrounding circumstances, so as to lead up to a general presumption as to the truth of the evidence. It would be an absurdity to say (the italics are mine) that no evidence of an accomplice can be received unless corroborated by other independent testimony, because then there would be no need of an accomplice's evidence." Robertson's confession was as follows: The latter end of January 1910 I was working at Bob Begg's at the corner of the Bow and High Rivers. One day in February Jack Fisk drove down with a team and bobsleigh to Begg's place. Mrs. Begg, the 2 children and I were the only ones there. He sold her a washing machine and a couple of patent fasteners for horse collars. This was the first time I met Jack Fisk. 2 or 3 weeks after this, old man Tucker came down to the river at Begg's for water. He said Jack Fisk's pigs disturbed the water at the top of the hill and he couldn't drink it. He took a barrel of water with him in his wagon. I rode the range for Begg for about a month looking after the cattle, and one day I rode over to Begg's gate at the northeast corner of his place, where I met Jack Fisk chasing his milk cows into Begg's place. I had some conversation with him about some horses, and he told me that old man Tucker was getting after him about some horses which he, Tucker, had lost. He said, "I'm scared the old man will get me into trouble." And as Tucker had no friends and no relations and no one to take care of him, he thought it would be a good thing to get him out of the way. I said, "If you have his horses, the old man is right and you should get into trouble." He then said to me, "If you will help me get Peach out of the way, you can have his land and I will take his horses as I want them." I didn't say anything about this as I was scared. He then threatened me and said, "If you say anything about this I will put a shot into you." I said nothing to anybody and rode home to Begg's, and he went on rolling his fall wheat. I used to meet him nearly every morning after this when I was riding, and he would ask me what I thought about it, and if I had said anything to anyone. We discussed the thing on and off for about 2 months, until the last Saturday in April. I think it was Saturday when I came into town to see about my job on the Canadian Pacific Railway, and stayed at the King Edward while in Calgary. Begg was in town and stopped me at the Dominion. The two of us went home on Monday. This would be the beginning of May. That afternoon the team I was working got up in a bunch and got away from me. Mrs. Begg sent me up to the top to look for them. While I was up on the hill I met Fisk, and he began talking about getting rid of old Peach, and said that if I helped him I could have the land and he would take the horses. He was to take them at any time he wanted them. I then agreed to help him. 2 weeks after this I went into Calgary and started working on the Canadian Pacific Railway as brakesman. I made a couple of trips and went out to Fisk's place the following Wednesday. Before going out to Fisk's I hired a rig from Frank Passac, who runs a store at De Winton, and told him that I was going to drive to Tucker Peach's. When I got to Fisk's place he sent me to Tucker's shack, about 300 or 400 yards away. This was Thursday afternoon. I helped Peach to clean his grain that afternoon, and talked to him about selling his place and horses. He made a memorandum on a sheet of paper which is now in Medicine Hat in my box. The memorandum showed what he wanted for the horses, land, etc. I went back to Fisk's that night and slept there. Fisk and I agreed that night we would kill Tucker Peach the next morning. He was to fire the first shot and I was to fire the second. He wanted me to fire the first, but I wouldn't. The next morning, Friday, the day of King Edward's funeral, about 6 o'clock, Fisk and I went to Peach's shack and tried to look into the window. We couldn't see anything as it was covered over with a tent. Note: the old man had an instinctive dread of Fisk, and on that account always fastened his door and covered his window. He would not have opened his door to Fisk. I knocked at his door and the old man called, "Who is there?" I said I was there, telling him my name. He opened the door. He had his drawers and shirt on. He sat down on his bed, which was on the floor, and started to put on his trousers. Fisk then fired a shot at Peach with a revolver. Blood started to trickle down his face and he fell back. Fisk handed the revolver to me and told me to do the same. I took the revolver, pointed it at Peach and fired. I don't know whether I hit him or not, I was so excited, but I guess I did. Peach never spoke. He was dead after the shot. We both came out of the shack and looked round to see if anyone was there, but there was no one in sight. We then hitched up Tucker's team and drove up to the door, rolled the body in some blankets, and drove it down to the Bow River at Tucker's lower place. We drove it into the river along the west fence on the west side of his property, and dumped the body into it. The blankets and cowskin which we rolled him in were tied round him. The river at this point runs east. From what I heard, the body was found about a quarter of a mile from where we dumped it. After this I came into town, having stayed at the Durbo School on Saturday night. I told some of them that I had bought the place. The team I took in were Peach's. I sold them to the Alberta barn for $200 and put the money in the savings bank of the Bank of Montreal. I was to give Fisk any money he needed. I gave him 2 payments. One was $50 and one $30. The amount show in my passbook. I went back to the ranch in about 2 weeks. I saw Ernest Adams there, and he told me that Fisk had been looking after the horses, and that 4 two-year-old horses were missing. Adams said he thought Fisk had stolen them. I didn't say anything. Shortly after this the body was found. Fisk, I think, was living on his place at the time, but shortly after this left for Carbon. Shortly before the body was found, I brought one of Peach's horses into town and traded it for one belonging to Mr. Gilmore, the plumber of 827 5th Avenue, West Calgary. I sold the horses I got from him to a grocer who had a store east of the post office for $18. I gave him a bill of sale. I sold a stud about 2 weeks ago. My cousin sold it for me. My cousin is E. Davis and is looking after the place for me. He knows nothing about this affair. Fisk threw the revolver we shot Peach with into the middle of the river. Signed, Thomas M. Robertson. With these details to guide us, our next task was, of course, to verify the story. We tried first to find the revolver in the river. I sent Robertson with Inspector Doofus and others in a motor to the spot. The days were short. The distance from Calgary was about 25 miles, and nothing but a motor could cover the ground in the hours of daylight. Slush ice was found to be running down the river. The water was very cold, up to a man's middle. It transpired that Robertson could not tell within 100 yards where the pistol had been thrown in, and the party returned without having accomplished anything in the way of corroboration. The headless trunk was at this time lying at an undertaker's place in Okotoks, and was in process of being cleaned and thawed out. When it was ready, Dr. Ravel's services were again called in. He spent several hours with the evil-smelling corpse, and the thoroughness of his examination was manifested when he found the bullet which Robertson had fired tucked away under the skin, just over the 8th rib on the left side. In the shirts that were on the body when found there were holes corresponding to the situation of the bullet. Adhering to the .32 calibre bullet were some minute particles of the underclothing through which it had passed, together with a single red fibre from the blanket, where it had passed through a stripe. The indications were that the bullet had struck the floor and glanced upwards. Robertson had said that his hand was very shaky. In the floor of the shack, close under the bed, which consisted of nothing more than a few gunny sacks filled with hay, we found an indentation made by the bullet in its course. The corroboration of Robertson's story, therefore, in that particular, was complete. We had once before examined this shack in a search for the dead man's money. He was known to have a sum variously estimated at from $1,200 to $1,500, but nobody knew where he kept it. He would not entrust it to a bank, and we were able to place in the witness box only one man who had ever seen him with a large sum of money in his hand. When we first entered the shack we found that it had been thoroughly ransacked and the money evidently found and carried off. We were utterly unable to place before Fisk's jury any evidence to connect him with the missing currency, but in April 1911, after Fisk's conviction, the one man who could have supplied the missing link permitted himself to talk to a neighbour, and I soon heard of it. It happened that he met Fisk at a little place called De Winton, and had supper with him at the Minto House Hotel. He saw Fisk pay for a 25-cent supper with a $10 bill, drawn from a large roll of bills which he had in his hand. He was surprised to see so much money, as Fisk was notoriously impecunious. This incident is a fair sample of the difficulty we experienced in collecting evidence. John Fisk seems to have terrorised the entire neighbourhood. It was no uncommon thing to hear a witness say, "If Fisk gets off, I shall have to quit the country." It was some weeks before I could obtain corroboration of Robertson's story as to the conveying of the body to the river, but it presently transpired that a settler named Robert Jones, who lived between Tucker Peach and the river, was working at a fence on his quarter section with an Indian boy when the funeral cortege passed down the trail. Both he and the boy recognised the Tucker Peach team and wagon, saw John Fisk in a khaki coloured shirt sitting on the front seat with the reins in his hand, and a person whom they took to be Robertson at the rear of the wagon box. A bitter controversy raged over this testimony when at length it was given, and desperate attempts were made to discredit it. One witness went the length of swearing that on a particular Sunday after church service he had had a conversation with Robert Jones, who had told him that he had not seen the team and wagon on the road to the river. This evidence was offset by a constable of the Mounted Police, who deposed that on the Sunday in question he spent the forenoon with Robert Jones, and that Jones did not go to church at all that day. It came out later, after Fisk had been hanged, that another settler and his daughter had also seen the team and wagon as described by Jones and the Indian boy, but refrained from saying a word about it for fear of Fisk's vengeance in case of his acquittal. Both father and daughter had given valuable testimony, but suppressed this important item. After sentence of death had been carried out, as I have said, the father met a juryman at High River and said, Your conscience may be quite clear about the verdict you gave. John Fisk was guilty all right." He then intimated, in a roundabout way, affected by the denizens of the Western States, that he and his daughter had seen the outfit, and that what Jones and the boy had said was true. Robertson was mistaken in telling us that the murder was committed on the day of the late King's funeral. It doubtless would have taken place on that day but for the circumstances that, when Fisk looked round in the morning, he saw Ernest Adams, Tucker Peach's nearest neighbour, moving about on a hill between their two houses, which commanded a view of Peach's shack, and his attention would possibly have been attracted by any shots fired then. Robertson went to visit Tucker Peach that afternoon, at Fisk's suggestion, and found him fanning some barley which he had contracted to sell for seed, and to fan which the old man had borrowed Adams' fanning mill. Robertson's evidence was to the effect that, after the barley had been cleaned, he helped Peach to load the mill onto his wagon, and he, Peach, returned the mill to its owner at about supper time. Adams, on the other hand, deposed that his mill was returned to him by Peach at dinner time midday. He said he couldn't be mistaken, because he asked Tucker to stay to dinner on that occasion, but the old man declined. Fisk was being defended by the most eminent criminal lawyer and K.C. in the province of Alberta, and he was not slow to make the most of this conflict of evidence. Robertson was in the witness box for 2 whole days, and the learned counsel, in effect, said to him, "You have admitted spending with Tucker Peach his last afternoon on earth. You killed the old man then, and now try to lay the blame on John Fisk." Herein, to my mind, lay the one chance that Fisk ever had of provoking a disagreement of the jury, and if his counsel had stopped there a reasonable doubt might have been raised, particularly as we were unable to show the money motive on Fisk's part. But the difficulty settled itself. Lord Brampton, in his memoirs, gives an interesting instance of a counsel who did not know when to stop cross-examining, and in consequence lost his case. There was something of the same sort here. Cross-examination, prolonged usque ad nauseam, presently elicited the fact that, in the course of the fanning operations, a man with a team and wagon arrived to fetch the seed barley for the purchaser, and took it away. He had to wait until the work was finished, and his evidence was conclusive proof that Robertson was right, and that Adams was wrong in saying that the mill had been returned to him by midday. This, too, disposed of the suggestion that the murder was committed by Robertson that afternoon. This evidence was all news to me. Nobody knew the name of the purchaser of the barley, and we were only able to secure his attendance at the last minute before the trial closed. From him we learnt the name of the hired man who had fetched the barley, and after extensive search found him near Montreal. He arrived just in time to give his evidence against Robertson, and deposed that the dead man had told him that he was in the process of selling out to Robertson. The trial of John Fisk began on February 21st, 1911, and lasted 10 days, 41 witnesses being examined for the prosecution. The jury brought in a verdict of guilty with a recommendation to mercy. This was to salve the susceptibilities of one of their number who was not in favour of capital punishment, and who required that concession. It had no effect whatever at Ottawa so far as mitigation of the penalty was concerned, and John Fisk was executed in the guardroom yard at Calgary on June 27, 1911. A Western politician once remarked in my hearing that he admired the Mounted Police, not so much for what they did, but for what they prevented. I wonder under which category such cases as this would come. Robertson's trial began on May 16th and continued 4 days. 43 witnesses were examined for the Crown and 6 for the defence. The jury appended a strong recommendation to mercy to their verdict of guilty, and the death sentence was in due course commuted to life imprisonment. There is no ground for any such supposition, but one might very readily believe that Robertson was acting under hypnotic suggestion. Sir Allan Aylesworth, the Minister of Justice, remarked to the Comptroller of the Mounted Police that these murder trials were the best worked up cases that had ever come under his notice. End of chapter 17, part 1.